Listener's note: today's podcast deals with issues of addiction and suicidal ideation. If you or someone you know is having any of these issues, please reach out to 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, or you may text them at 988. Thank you. Hello, this is Leslie Dilbeck. I am one of your hosts for White Knuckling Through Life. This is episode number 7. We're super excited to have our guest today, Van Patten. Diann's going to give some tidbits of how she knows him. I always say Diann knows the most interesting people, and she has brought yet another guest who has an extraordinary story of resilience to share. Our last episode, we talked about recovery from trauma, and our guest shared with us some resources. So if you haven't heard that episode, I really encourage you to do that. Actually, I encourage you to go to the very beginning and hear how we started this. So go to episode 1, download it, follow us, like us, share it with your friends, family, or anybody that you think needs a message of hope, because that's really what we're here to do. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Diann, and she's going to tell us about our guest, but also may have a little message of her own to share. All right, Diann.
Absolutely. Hi, Leslie. Good to see you today. And Herb, I want to thank Herb for being with us. Before I share my little story, I want to tell you how I know Herb. Herb and I met at a conference, and it seems to be the theme. I meet the most amazing people in our industry. And he and I were talking, and initially we were talking about sales, and we're both vice presidents, head of a sales department, and we were talking about our people and getting them to work, and how we can best support our people. And that's kind of a theme in our life, is to support people and help people in what they're doing. So Herb immediately was just the nicest guy in the world. Herb, you want to tell us just a little bit about yourself, and don't share what you're going to share today, because it's an extraordinary story, and we'll get into that.
Yeah, again, Herbert Van Patten. My role is Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at ISIS Solutions. We're a nurse case management company. But more importantly, Leslie and I were talking early on, and my connection to ISIS and the family, we are a family corporation, goes back to March of 1991. And so I have a long history with the organization, with the family. But how you and I came about, and for me to be on this podcast, is I remember first hearing about your podcast when you created it, and then I started watching it. And it's so important that we talk about mental health issues, because contrary to how I was raised and what I went through, it's something we never talked about. There was a stigma to it, there was shame to it, and it was best never talked about. And so I'm so happy that there are podcasts like yours, and especially yours, where you're highlighting that. Part of what we do at ISIS is one of our values is to give generously. And one of the 4 main charitable groups we give to is mental health. And we work very closely with the Orange County Mental Health Association. So we are all about helping those with mental health issues, those who are going through hard times. And so that's what led me to being interested in your podcast.
Well, that's fantastic. And, it's interesting knowing your story, how there could be any stigma associated with it based off of what you went through. So we're going to leave it there until I want to share this a little bit. We're talking about trying to eliminate the stigma around the world. And I am an incoming Rotary president. I was at PETS training, as they call it, President-elect's training. And we had the international incoming president come speak to us. Now, this is a very busy man. He travels the entire world, spreading the message for Rotary and all the things that we do. But his personal motto is to bring hope to the world. And he has the emphasis of making sure that we de-escalate or remove the stigma of mental health. He had a brother that committed suicide, And it affected him to the point that this is now his life's mission. So I'm really happy that around the world, people are trying to provide the same message as we are. So Herb, let's talk a little bit about you. What is it that when you were young and you were, your father was a dignitary? Can you start there and tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, like Leslie's husband, my father also was in federal law enforcement. He spent his entire life in law enforcement. First as local police officer, then moving up into detective, and then crossing over into federal law enforcement. And that's really the bridge over into my story. Is my father, just a little bit on him. As children, my brother and I looked up to my father as just this idol, almost in a movie figure, because of the types of missions he was on, what he did as a law enforcement officer. Also, back in the day where we were raised, I was born in 1962, so that gives you some time frame for how we were raised. We were raised in a working class environment where kids were left to do what they will until the dinner bell rang, and then we came home. But we didn't see my dad much because he was either always in training or always off doing something, a mission, as we later found out. And so we were raised as young boys, as most of our friends were, by figures like John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, these tough, tall, dark, and handsome types who, when they were suffering, whether it was a gunshot wound or something else which was never mentioned, you suffered in silence. And in fact, that became my lifelong mantra until I realized I needed to stop using that. But suffer in silence, if you ask my wife, she got so sick of hearing me say that. And now looking back, it was the worst thing I could have ever done, because that's what we were trained to do as young boys. And then as men is you have to be tough. You can't show any weakness or what we thought was weakness, because that was a shameful thing for any man to do. And so, as part of my dad's law enforcement career, he eventually became a criminal investigator with the Customs Department. And this was back in the latter part of the 70s, where from California, he took an assignment in Ecuador, South America. And so we went from the beaches of Southern California to this strange land. And the reason why he was sent to Ecuador is that at that time was the beginning of the Colombian drug cartels, but the cocaine train started in Bolivia, went up through Peru, through Ecuador, and then into Colombia, where it was then the cocaine was distributed into the United States. So my dad was part of the interdiction effort, and his job specifically was to work with the Ecuadorian government, the various agencies, military police, their customs department, and so on and so forth. And he served as an advisor and would work to interdict the drug traffic that was coming from the South.
Okay, Herb, let me ask a question of you. Now, how old are you when your father gets this assignment and you guys are now going to be living in a foreign land?
Yeah, I just turned 15, and we were down there for a total of 4 years. We lived in 2 different cities, Guayaquil, Ecuador, which is the largest port city, known in its history for piracy and all kinds of thieves and malcontents. And then we spent another 2 years in Quito, Ecuador, the capital, which is the direct opposite. It's 9,200 feet in the Andes, somewhat of a Shangri-La, just a beautiful city.
Now, this is a beautiful city, but this is where the most traumatic experience of your life happens, correct?
Absolutely. Again, we didn't see much of our dad because he was always gone, but we knew he was out there doing great things and involved in this, what was truly a drug war. What eventually happened to him is something that happened to a lot of those who were involved in that war on both sides. And whether it's the Americans advising or the Ecuadorian government troops, a lot of people were losing their lives. And unfortunately, my dad was one of them. And when it happened, it was December 22nd, 1980. I know that because I was just about the next day I was supposed to leave to the Galapagos Islands. It's something you did when you live in Ecuador. I hadn't been there. For those who've experienced this, and that is the knock on the door, there's no way to describe it, but there's a certain knock that when I heard it, I knew before we even answered the door. And that was the assistant ambassador coming to tell us that my father was killed in the line of duty. From that moment on, things changed for me. Of course, there was the initial shock. And just to give a little context to what happens, at least what the protocol was then, that when the family member who's part of the embassy community is killed, you have to move the family out of the country within 72 hours. So for us, it was essentially 48 hours where we had we couldn't even collect any of our anything. Others would do that for us. But the day after my father was killed, here I was, a young, just recently turned 18 years old. And I'm the one, because my brother was living in Florida, my mom was a complete wreck, as anybody could understand. I was the one who was responsible for going to the embassy, arranging the affairs of my father. But first I had to identify my father. And that's where the initial shock and trauma came. My dad, again, this idol that we worship, to see him in a state where not only was he dead, but he was not in good shape. And from that moment on was really the shock that reverberated through the next quite a few years. So within 48 hours, we are flown back, end up in Portland, Oregon. That's where my father was born. We had a memorial for him. And then life went on. Life went on until 9 months later, I graduated from high school and was now in my first semester at junior college. And this is the one moment I remember that really kicked off what later I learned was post-traumatic stress. I didn't know at the time, but I was in Professor Lugo's Psychology 101 course. And Professor Lugo, if you can envision Albert Einstein, but not a gentle Albert Einstein. He was a mad-haired scientist, actually a wonderful human being, but loved to play with his students. So we had one exercise where he said, okay, everybody, in a heavy German accent, I want you to write down what all your problems are. And you have 10 minutes. And so I thought this was a game. And so I put my pencil down on the paper and just folded my hands. And he said, why aren't you writing? I said, because there's nothing wrong with me. And without a blink, he said, you're psychotic. There was something about him saying you're psychotic. He didn't mean it, but my world did this. It tilted. And it remained that way. And a cold shock went through me and my world went sideways. I didn't know what happened, but I sat through the class on the verge of a panic attack. And at the end, I made my way down without stumbling. And I asked Dr. Lugo, do you really think I'm psychotic? He said, no, you're just an idiot. Get out of here. That didn't help. And from that moment on, things would never be the same, except for about 6 or so years later. But that's what led to ongoing trauma and issues.
Okay, Herb, so let's talk about this real quick. You come back to America, you have service for your dad, you get re-enrolled in school, and life seems very normal. So yes. Your family moved into a house. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how it seems so normal, because obviously after a death of a loved one like that, I mean, most of us do not have a parent that is assassinated. And so this has got to really be reeling in your family. How is it you dealt with it so it felt normal, even though it wasn't?
Yeah, that's a great question, because, as it said, a trauma like this to a family can do one of two things to that family. It could either bring them together, where they go through it together, or it can tear them apart. For us, it tore us apart. My brother, he came for the memorial and then went back to Florida. My mother was coping with it in her way. For me, as I only learned later, my way of coping with it is almost to put it behind me, to think that this never happened and just to move forward. That was my way of thinking, well, strong men, you just move forward. And that was it. So each of us were dealing with it in our own way. And my way was not to deal with it at all, was just to put it behind me like a strong man's supposed to be and go on with my life. And that's just what happens.
We've really done a disservice to our men by telling them they just need to be strong and hold on, and you'll get through this, power through it, you'll be fine. I mean, what a disservice we have done. Obviously you're not the only person that has gone through that. So I cannot wait to hear how you broke through that and been able to deal with it. Cause it's gotta be once you did that access and that tilt, I imagine your life was really crooked for a long time, right?
It was, and it really took the form of, not every day was bad, but most days were anywhere from bad to very bad. And what I mean by that is I seemed to be cycling from the shock, from anger to bargaining, and then to depression, and then as part of the depression, crushing despair. And looking back, I can sort things out, but at the time, it felt like I was going through phases. I had no idea what those feelings were. I'd be angry and have no outlet for that anger. Then, as part of trying to deal with the anger, trying to reconcile what was happening to me, I had no idea for the anger. All I knew was that my paternal grandmother suffered from severe mental illness. Later on, we realized she had severe bipolar disease, but we didn't know what it was. Everybody just said she was crazy, and so I thought I had inherited that. I suspected I had, but suspecting that, I realized that if I was suffering from being crazy, that the one thing that would save me is to get through it without having it diagnosed. So therefore, suffering in silence, not talking to anybody, was eventually the way I was going to work my way out of it. Unfortunately, it just kept me in this cycle of anger, bargaining, and crushing despair over and over.
Was there no grief counseling for you guys? Because you are obviously experiencing, the different steps of grief. Was there no grief counseling for you back then?
There was none. There was none. I think that was the initial injury to the trauma, which is we had to get out of country, and we ended up in Portland, Oregon, not where we came from, being in Southern California, and that was it. We were just kind of let go.
Leslie?
Yeah, I appreciate that you're bringing up suffering in silence, because that is one of the things I talk about with people that I can tell. They'll give me little hints that they're suffering, but they won't come out and say, I'm depressed, or I'm having anxiety really bad, or this or that. And I remember talking to a friend, and he was like telling me, oh God, I'm just like, I had a panic attack and I didn't know what to do. I felt sick. And he's married, has 3 kids. And here he was telling me this. And I go, so you suffered in silence? And he's like, yeah, exactly. And I said, that is just so isolating. You feel like you are crazy because you're trying to be normal and put a normal face on, but yet you're just at your worst mentally. And the people around you probably do want to help you, but you're afraid to even say anything, because there's one of 2 things. I think if you say it becomes that, and you're afraid of what that is, or 2, you're embarrassed. And so it's important, and I thank you for bringing it up for those listening to this, that you don't have to suffer in silence. And that'll be part, I'm sure, what Herb has to share with us, is that there was a point in time where he probably decided he didn't need to do that any longer. So what was your next, like, how did you go through those cycles and then eventually become weary of that process?
So first, there were those around me who knew. I didn't know that until decades later, that they knew I was suffering. I thought I was putting on a good enough mask, and that's what it was. And what eventually led to me speaking to somebody was the crushing despair. Those moments became so crushing that suicidal ideation became a regular thing, to the point where, for example, nights were the worst. Every light that I could turn on in the house, I turned on, because I was afraid that I wouldn't make it through. That's when the goblins came out, and that's when the suicide became the next best option. Spoiler alert, that didn't happen, but I thought it was inescapable, and that there was no way out of the crushing despair. So eventually, one day, I got up the courage to tell my mother. And I told her, Mom, I think I'm crazy and I need to speak to someone. And that's what led to me finally finding eventually a way out of that cycle. Because I was brought up a Catholic, of course, the first option was to go speak to the Catholic therapist. At the time, I had a few sessions. I didn't think they were doing anything because I remained in that cycle. Little did I know that every time I spoke to another nun, that was part of the process of speaking to somebody and getting it out. But that's eventually what led me out of that cycle. And one of the nuns did say, it seems like you're stuck in the grieving process, that you haven't enabled yourself to go through that, and that's what you need to do. That being said, there was really no vehicle to do that other than praying, and praying wasn't working for me. And so eventually I came across, of the dozens of books I've read on grief, the one that really stuck was one from Judy Tatumbaum, and it's called The Courage to Grieve. And once I read it, it actually didn't explain what grief was. It normalized the feelings I was having. Everything I was experiencing, she wrote it in that book. And that book became tattered by the time over the years, I read it and used it as a resource and a reference. That helped a bit, but I was still going through the cycles. And it wasn't until I finally found the right therapist. His name was Dr. David Steele, Long Beach, California. And because he wasn't part of the church, my first session with him was he just listened, and then said, okay, go back home, see me next week. I'm going to research this. I came back the next week and he said, there's a relatively new diagnosis called PTS, post-traumatic stress syndrome back then. And he said, you're a textbook case because of what you're describing to me, what you're suffering from, the initial trauma. The magic of him simply putting a label to it, where I had thought, oh my God, I'm now this is being passed down from my grandmother to me. I'm crazy. There's no escape. Once he put a label on it, for me, once he did that, my world did that. I was still raw, and it'd still be a year and a half before I could claim that I was past it. But it was at that point where I was eventually able to escape that cycle by going all the way back and then going through and doing a lot of just self-analysis, doing a lot of talking to others about it, and finally realizing that it's not shameful to get it out. It's not only helpful, but my survival depended on it. And so what I did to celebrate me finally figuring out what it was, and I still had another year plus before that rawness was healed. I picked up my surfboard, flew to Australia, bought a car, and basically lived out of the car and was a surf bum for quite a few months. And that was a big part of celebrating my healing process. It's just getting out, reconnecting, and being alone. And when I came back, that's when I really started feeling.
Kurt, now let's talk about how long it did take you, because I think people, I hear people when they do lose a loved one, they're going through the cycle. A lot of them are like, I am so stuck on, one portion of it. I can't wait till I get to the next. And I totally understand that, because we want to be better tomorrow. We don't necessarily have the patience. And it sounds like you were really aware of this once you got your diagnosis, once you understand the grieving process. From beginning to end, how long did it take? Because I think it's important for people to know this is not something that happens typically in a month to even a year.
It's not. Now, for me, the total process took just over 6 years. And that's relatively short. As I've learned since by studying grief, it can last a lifetime. And in fact, that void of that loved one leaving never is really filled, but it's a matter of going through grief, grieving properly, and then resolving it, and being able to remember that loved one with fondness as opposed to having that pain. Certainly there are days where I talk openly with my mom, my wife, even my daughters about the fact that my dad wanted to have granddaughters. If nothing else, he wanted to have granddaughters and to be alive to see them. So I'll think about those things and think, boy, it's a shame that he hasn't seen, that he isn't here to see that. But it doesn't come with crushing pain. It just comes with the fond memories of my father, and the fact that I wish you were here to see it.
Yes, I appreciate you sharing the timeline, because one of the things that I felt when I was going through the stuff we talked about in the second episode with my daughter, I thought, this is never going to end. Like, this is my life. This is the rest of my life. And this is horrible. And I don't want to live this way. And knowing that there was a light at the end of the tunnel, and we've talked about it in other episodes, is helpful, I think, to those who are listening, because you can feel like when you're going through something like this, that you're sharing, that it's just, that's your lot in life, and that's the best it's going to get. And so I hope people hear that point of it, that there is that healing, but it sounds like you had to do a lot of work to get there. And we've talked about that in our other sessions. So what other work did you do? I mean, you went to counseling, you said a lot of introspection. Was there anything else?
Yeah, read a lot of books. I was an English major in college, so I fell in love with the existential writers just to learn about life experience through them. But more importantly, I knew that there had to be something greater than myself. And while I was brought up Catholic and understood the importance of faith, that really wasn't working for me. So eventually I came to embrace Stoicism and the philosophies of Stoicism, because they were practical and I could put them in place. They were easily understood. And through that, it gave me a stronger foundation for my place in this world, my experience in this world. And I was able to see that I'm one of many billions of individuals on this earth, each with their own struggles, going through life as it comes to them. But what this whole experience did for me is it did two things, or three things. It engendered in me gratitude, humility, and a need to serve others and to help others in any way I can. One thing that I did without even knowing why until later on is I'm a mentor, and I would go out of my way to help others, to the point where my wife would be irritated because sometimes it would infringe on our time. She said, "Why do you always have to help people?" I said, "I don't know. I'm compelled to do it." It was only later on that I realized that it's because that's what I didn't have. I was, again, my dad was never around. We knew he loved us, but he just didn't have the time. And so right at that moment where I needed him most, as a young man about to cross that threshold into manhood, he was taken away, and I never had that. So it was only later that I really understood what my compulsion, where it was rooted, and it was rooted in the fact that I didn't have that. I want to make sure that others, if I could help them in any way, that I could help guide them, whether it's about life or business or whatever. And I still have that to this day. It's just something I'm compelled to do.
Well, it's excellent that you've been able to tunnel the things that maybe were the hardest on you to help others. And a lot of times we just have to get out of our own, or reach outside of ourselves in order to heal. Because I imagine if you didn't help people, that would have crushed your spirit, because that's who you are. So it's great that you were true to yourself and that you found a way that helped. And I'm sure you found that balance with your wife. That's an important thing.
And yes, I did. We're going to be celebrating 31 years here next month. Yes, she's the best partner I could ever have.
Oh, that's lovely.
And the humility piece of it, I think it ties into things we've talked about in the past, the vulnerability, because, in a way, sharing your story is, you have to have humility to be okay with, like, people might think I am crazy, or people might think I wasn't man enough, or whatever the issue, whatever the concept might be. But to be able to share in that way has probably opened up other people to be like, whoa, okay, you just told me that. Now I'm going to tell you this about me, and here's what I'm struggling with. And it can be such a beautiful thing. And I think basically that's how Diann and I became so close, because I don't know how it, we just, our relationship grew out of sharing our struggles and being vulnerable with each other, even though, here we are in a business setting and just being able to do that. And it helped me so much with my healing process and knowing that there was hope. And had Diann not been humble enough to tell me about her experiences with her son and vulnerable in that way, who knows how long it might have taken me to get to a place that I could feel not completely healed, but I will say free. And that reminds me of when you went to Australia with your surfboard. It sounds like you reached a place where you took off the heavy weight of what was holding you down to go live life, enjoy it, and still continue to heal, of course. But is that point in your life came about? Did you see it that way, or how did that go into your healing process?
I absolutely saw that and knew that it was a threshold moment, that I was crossing a bridge to my next phase. And so I treated it as such. It was a reverential time to take that time and to do a lot of thinking and to a lot of self-examination and to try to resettle myself, because even though I felt that my world had righted itself, I was still very raw. It was a very, very long struggle. It felt like every day was focused on just trying to make it to the next day. And so going to Australia, putting myself in a completely different world was a big part of it, where I could just leave, focus on me, and then come back. And we talk about my mentoring. That's still part of my healing. Even though I'm humbled enough to admit that anybody can be vulnerable at any time. So even though I feel like I'm bulletproof, history has proven that I'm not. So part of the mentoring, whether it's DECA, being helping young kids be better, or helping young professionals, or even mid-career professionals, is all part of that serving and giving, which does continue to serve as a healing process.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story and allowing us to see your healing journey, because I'm sure there are people on this podcast listening. Everybody's story is different, but somebody's might be a little similar. I think that's why Leslie and I were able to really connect. I mean, we knew each other for years, but we had no real reason to connect. And then, we had this same thing in common. So we were able to grow closer because of it, and become freer because of our friendship and ability to share with others.
Yeah, we need to, as a culture and society, we need to normalize the fact that feeling these things, experiencing these things, is part of what we go through as human beings. And yes, while some of these episodes can be acute and some of these things can be clinical, most everybody is dealing with this, if not on a continual basis, at some time or another. And the best thing we can do is share it with each other, talk, because we've all experienced it. And there's no shame to it. In fact, the only shameful part is if we don't share our experience that might help others. So I think what you're doing here is absolutely necessary. It's just another brick in the foundation for helping all of us get through life.
Well, our goal is to help people find solutions to walk through this with as much grace as possible. Sometimes it's very clumsy, but that's okay. Hey, Leslie, do you have any closing words?
I appreciate your story and appreciate you sharing. And I do want to encourage people to talk more. I think that's important, and you can find your safe person. It just always comes about. For some reason, somebody will be brought into your life that you feel like you are comfortable enough to share with. If not, we have the resources that are at the beginning of this recording. If you or somebody else is suffering from mental health issues, those phone numbers are available for you. And I've actually heard of a person needing to use it to call, and it was a really excellent resource for them. We want to continue to provide you with good messages of hope, of resiliency. And as we go through the regular podcasting that we have scheduled, our next one that's going to be coming up is a good friend of mine who suffered a stroke, and pretty much she was not supposed to live because she was hemorrhaging, and she had to learn how to walk and talk, and all basic functional activities of daily living, do them all over again. So she's going to share with us her story and provide us some inspiration, and that will be in the next couple of weeks. We aim to do these every 2 weeks, although Diann and I are in our busy conference season, so we'll see how it goes. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. Remember to be kind to yourself, be kind to others, and sprinkle it everywhere like glitter. Until next time, this is White Knuckling Through Life, Leslie and Diann. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Herb.